as we were together last time, we were looking at this command to all believers. And I think it's important to note that this is to all believers. So often in the church today, the idea is that polemics, apologetics, giving a defense is only for a certain class of people. Now don't confuse what I'm saying here. I don't believe that it is pastorally responsible to send immature Christians off to the local mosque to witness for Jesus alone. I mean, if they want to come along and, when we passed out tracts to the Mormons, for example, and I have to be careful, I've got Muslims and Mormons, and you don't want to mix the two together. Their beliefs are about as opposite one another as you can get, even though there are some fascinating parallels between Muhammad and Joseph Smith. Maybe I'll get a chance to mention some of those too. They're fascinating parallels. But the resultant beliefs are about as far apart from one another as you can get. But when we would go out to Mesa, Arizona during the Easter pageant, or up to Salt Lake City, we came up with a rule eventually. You could not pass out our literature. We would not give it to you to pass out. We would not allow you to stand with us to pass it out if you were not a member in good standing of a local Bible-believing church. We wouldn't let you do it. Why? Well, what does Hebrews 13 say? Be in subjection to those who have the rulership over you. If you're already in rebellion against one command of Scripture, you don't need to be out there telling other people they need to be repenting of their violations of Scripture. And I have seen people take a class like this and jump on their white horses and head off to convert Group X and end up in Group X. So there is an appropriate pastoral concern that there be sufficient maturity. And isn't that what we have in 1 Peter 3:15? Before hetoimoi ei pros apologion, before all was ready to give a defense, an apologion, you have the first part. Sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts. Now, I don't think any one of us does that perfectly every day. If we set apart, treated as holy, the Messiah as who he really is, the Lord, Yahweh, in our hearts, in all of our thoughts, in all of our speech, in all of our actions, well, we wouldn't be sinning. We wouldn't be loving ourselves. We wouldn't be engaging in those things that deny his lordship. And so Peter's point is not to start with apologetics, but that the person who has the proper Christian worldview, and we use that term so shallowly these days. We hear it all the time. But the person who is truly putting out an effort to order his or her thoughts, all of their life, not just the quote-unquote religious life, that is a Western canard that we need to get rid of. That you can have your religious life, and then you have your secular life, and you have your sports life, and your private life, and your educational life. No, the Bible never sees man in these types of ways. If you have set apart the Messiah as kurios, as Lord in your hearts, then his lordship will determine everything that you believe about all aspects of reality. And this is vital for the believer. I've got so many things crowding into my mind at one time that I want to get to that I just don't know what I'm going to get to, that sometimes I start getting frustrated. People will ask me, they'll watch a debate, and they'll ask me, they'll say, you never let that guy off that point. No matter how many smoke bombs he threw and dust he threw in the air, you kept going back to the same thing. You saw, where did you learn to do that? It's not a matter of learning to do something. It is a matter of seeing the presuppositions and foundations and consistency of an argument or a position. Now, for me, it is almost a physical thing. Okay, that may be something that's weird about me. I know my daughter inherited it, so it might be something that's somewhat genetic. But when I hear an argument My mind is analyzing it all the time, and I am testing it for consistency. Now, by the way, should I mention this to you? It ruins a lot of what sounds like really good preaching, because I can't just turn that off. And there are some humdinger sermons that just leave people going, wow, it was great. And I'm the old wet rag in the back going, well, in reality, and I don't want to say anything about it, but, you sort of go, okay, sort of stretched it a little bit here. And I know some folks that are pretty well-known preachers, and every once in a while you just sort of cringe at how they made that great point. And you sort of go, I wouldn't want to defend that one in a debate, but let's just move on from there, and you don't necessarily want to make a big deal out of it unless they start making a dogma out of it. But that ability to examine the presuppositions of an argument and to test it for consistency. Could you imagine if we applied that in the political realm to those things we call debates that take place, which aren't really debates at all? Is there any even effort to try to actually be factually truthful and consistent in those things? I can't find any. That's vitally important. And all of it goes back to, well, why would that be a Christian attribute? Because if Christ is kurios, he is the way, the truth, and the life, then my dedication to truth is not just some crusade of mine, it's a part of my personal following of Jesus Christ. I am, in essence, denying my own profession of who I say he is when I show myself to be unconcerned about truth and consistency. And so unconcerned that I won't even push myself to the point of being consistent in my own thinking and in my own theology. Shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be that way. So the first thing that Peter says, set your priorities in order, and therefore the person who has those proper priorities, there's going to be an impact upon that person's life. Because notice, to whom is the apologion, the apology, the defense given? To everyone asking. Pantito aitunti, to everyone asking. Ever notice that? This is talking about a situation where because of your speech, your life, your behavior, your actions, they somehow see that you have a what? Elpidos, you have a hope. There is a hope within you that they don't have. Now, when does that come out? When do people see hope in you? For example, right now I'm hoping that Richard's going to get up and cool it off in here because I'm starting to swelter in this sweater. That's a hope. But he's not going to because someone else is doing it for him. When does that hope come out? Toughest job God ever gave me. And believe me, he threw me into the middle of it. On one Monday, we still call it Black Monday in our ministry. In one Monday, 60% of all of our funding disappeared in one day. And I needed to find a way to feed a wife and 2 kids. And I had just been witnessing to some Mormon missionaries at a guy's house. It was interesting, the missionaries had fought with each other over who got to take home the one copy of Letters to a Mormon Elder I had with me. And you know why they did? The new cover, it's not the one that I assigned here, but I have a second book on Mormonism, which is really the one to give to Mormons. I had designed a picture on the front that was all designed around the things that were important in a missionary's life. Had all their tracks. It had believe it or not, I even included in the picture one of those little metal things that you put around your pants to keep your pants from getting in the chain on your bike. They all had those things, okay? And so once I showed the picture to them and showed what was on it, they were fighting with each other as to who got to take the book home with them. It was rather fun. This guy was leaving the Phoenix area. He was moving away. And he was one of the 2 staff chaplains at Thunderbird Samaritan Hospital in Phoenix. And he said, you really ought to make application there. Now, some people will dispute this, but there's just no disputing it. I'm a Scotsman. I've traced my genealogy, both sides of the family, all the way back to Scotland. I know what clans I come from. I have 2 kilts, and he can prove it. He's seen me in a kilt on one of the cruises we did, which doesn't make me Scottish, but it makes me think I'm Scottish at the very least. And the one thing about me, I'm not comfortable just walking into someone's hospital room. That's not me. That's hard for me to try to break through that ice or do that type of thing. But here I found myself at the hospital making application, and of all the people that applied, guess who got it? And as a result, how many of you have heard of my book, The King James Only Controversy? Okay, that's my best-selling book. My second best-selling book, Grieving, Our Path Back to Peace. How many of you knew I wrote a book on grieving? Only a few people. For the first 48 weeks out of 52 I was in that job, I wasn't supposed to have to do this, but the other guy was out candidating at different churches. I ran the lost support group at Thunderbird Spearnet. That is not a Christian place. So I am dealing with people who have lost a loved one. And man, I was thrown into the lion's den on this. I went and tried to buy books to try to learn something. And oh my goodness, the books stank. From a theological perspective, they were horrible. All of them were, you need to distance God from this. God had nothing to do with this. That's brilliant. So God had nothing to do with this, but now I'm going to tell you God has a wonderful plan for your life. Right, okay. He was sleeping during that, but he'll be awake now? What? It was horrible. And it was a real growing experience. I had never seen anybody die. And in the first few weeks, I saw it over and over again. You had to be in the cancer wing. You had to be in the CCU, the critical care unit. Whenever that code bell would go off, you'd have to rush to the emergency room. To this day, some people have sounds on their phones that sound like the code bell at Thunderbird Samaritan, and it makes me break out in a sweat every time I hear it when it goes off. Because whatever I was doing, I had to drop what I was doing and get there. And I saw good deaths, I saw bad deaths. I saw a lot more bad deaths than I saw good deaths. But the good deaths that I saw, I'll never forget. Never forget. Never forget this 92-year-old saint of the Lord, patient as the day is long. I never got to talk to the man. I regret that. But oh, the nurses, every time I'd come in there, they'd say, oh, you've got to talk to this guy. He's unconscious right now. But oh, he's just, every time you take blood from him, he looks at you and says, thank you, honey. And I talked with one of the nurses, and I'm getting to my point, believe me, I'm sorry, but I'm a preacher, so I tell stories. And she said, I held his hand one day, and I said, you know you're dying, right? He says, oh, yes, I know, honey. Everybody was honey. And she says, are you afraid? You want to know what it means to finish well? Here's a man that illustrated it. Because here is a nurse who asks him, are you afraid to die? And his response was, honey, I've talked with the Lord for almost 90 years. Why should I be afraid to go see him? Wow. And it just so happened, if there is a just so happen in this world, that I was in his room with this one relative that was there. And after a number of months in the hospital, I had a science background. Like I said, I finished a major in biology. I learned to read the monitors. You learn to see the signs. I'm talking with her, and I'm looking up at the monitor, and I'm looking down at him. And I go, I think it's happening right now. And that very nurse comes in, holds one hand, relative holds the other hand. I have my arm around her, and he slips into eternity. Now, when I compare that with some of the absolutely hopeless deaths that I saw at that hospital, the wailing and the feeling of abandonment and no hope in the future. And the one thing I learned, because we were close to Sun City, and I would see widows come in, and they had lost a husband of 50 years, 55 years, 60 years. The one thing I learned was, if they had hope for the future, they would get through it. If they had no hope for the future, I wouldn't see them for very long. And they probably wouldn't live very long either. We've all seen that happen. Long-term couples die within a short period of time with one another. Not because there's something wrong with the other one, but because their entire identity was gone and they had no hope for the future. That term hope means a lot. And there's something about treating Christ, the Messiah, as Lord in one's heart that creates a hope that is visible. It's so visible. Why? Because it impacts, we talk about impacts your life. What do we mean by that? Your speech, your words, your thinking, and especially how you respond to difficulty, to trials, to tribulations. We shouldn't react like the world. We should not react like the world. There's something about this that results in a natural asking concerning the reason. It's actually the term logos, which is one of the most widely used terms. I mean, it has such a huge semantic domain to it. But they're asking you a reason concerning the in you hope, your internal hope. And they're asking you, why? Why do you respond differently? Why do you react differently when the economy crashes? Why do you act differently in time of war, in time of loss? How many of you have read Jonathan Edwards, the biography of Jonathan Edwards by Ian Murray? Were you as convicted as I was when you got to Sarah's letter that she wrote to her daughter when Sarah found out about Jonathan's death? I will never forget that. Do you remember what she said? Here she has just been informed of Jonathan's death. You remember how he died, right? A botched smallpox inoculation. I mean, can you imagine the lawsuit that would result today? I mean, the lawyers would have been descending on everything. But what's her response? Is her response to be angry about the botched inoculation? Cry out to God, why me after all that I've done? This great man of God, why would you? No, none of that. None of that. Her letter to her daughter, and if I recall correctly, am I correct that her daughter died even before receiving the letter? Because as I recall, she had sorrow upon sorrow there for a while. I mean, we just don't realize how fleeting life could be at that particular point in time. But her whole emphasis was, may I not do anything that would detract from the glory of God. May I praise his goodness and his mercy and his grace, and may he keep me from doing anything that would detract from his glory in this incident. And I'm just like, wow, that would definitely take a lot of grace. A lot of grace. That's not how you normally see things. That is a hope that has so impacted how someone responds at the very crisis points of life. Not on Sunday morning, but when death strikes, when tragedy of the greatest proportion strikes, that it results in people naturally asking, why? For a reason. Because remember, logos is related to logic. So they're not asking you about your feelings. They're asking you why you possess something they don't possess. And finally, we get to the actual point that most apologists spend all their time on. Always ready to give an apologia. Now, apologia was a term that everyone knew back then. We use an apology in a completely non-classical sense today, in the sense that it's, well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that. But that's not, of course, what it means. Socrates gave an apologia for his life. One of the most famous works of the great apostate convert to Roman Catholicism in the 19th century, John Henry Cardinal Newman, was apologia pro vita sua, a defense for my life. That's the classical meaning of the term, an apologia, a defense. And so notice it does not say once in a while, it says hetoi moi ei, always ready. That's a tall order. I'll admit, I don't always feel like giving a defense. I mean, I've spent my life doing it, but sometimes I don't feel like it. But you see, if the orderedness of our heart under the lordship of Christ is such that we are always giving evidence of having this hope internally, then we must always be ready to give a reasoned defense. That's what an apologian is. An apologian is not a, oh, well, I just feel it. No one, I don't think anyone in the ancient world would have viewed that as an apologia. And I know I went to a church from, for about 11 years, where it was considered dogma that you're simply giving your testimony was equal to anything that anyone else could give. That was considered a dogma. Well, I don't want to put anybody's testimony down, and giving one's testimony is an important thing. But I thought we were to grow in the grace and knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. And I thought that the elders in the church, for example, were tasked with being able to refute those who contradict and to exhort in sound doctrine. And there's supposed to be an advancement, and there's supposed to be an ability to glorify Christ by giving a clear defense of his truth. And if all we can do is do what the Mormon missionary does, when you've got the Mormon missionary up against the ropes, he'll say, well, I prayed about it. Yeah, and what happened? Well, I got this warm burning in my bosom. And that's their testimony. It had to be the Holy Spirit, because I prayed about whether the Book of Mormon was true or not, and my bosom burned within me. Now, I'm not questioning the role of spiritual warfare in that instance. And I can tell you some hair-raising stories with Mormons on a spiritual level. But for the vast majority of those young guys, they're just repeating what they've been told. They didn't have any warm burning in their bosom. And for those who were converts, if that was the first time they had prayed in 10 years, of course they had a warm feeling in their bosom. But it could have just as well been the anchovies on the pizza. I don't eat anchovies on a pizza. Oh, you do? I knew you would. Could have been anything. That's not a foundation for truth. And is that all we are reduced to? I don't believe so, not from the New Testament perspective. Yes, even the newest convert has his testimony, but the newest convert's desire should be to grow in the grace and knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ and to make advancement in the things of God, so that the testimony that one gives is an apologia, a reasoned defense that demonstrates you've actually spent some time thinking about it. You say, wait a minute, isn't that contradiction of what Jesus said? Jesus said, don't give any thought to what you're going to say. He was talking about in positions of persecution. He was talking about being dragged out of the synagogues and brought before leaders. He wasn't talking about in the everyday situation where someone comes to you and says, man, you just got hit in the chops with life, and you have a joy I don't understand, but I want it. What's with you? And you need to be able to give an answer. That's what this is talking about. But with gentleness and fear. Now, the term that is used there is phobos. And I don't do this just because Richard is here and he's the Greek professor and I'm trying to drum up business for the Greek class, because you do want to take the Greek class. I loved teaching Greek. I haven't got to teach it for years now, and I feel really bummed about that, but maybe someday. But the reason I mention this is sometimes your professors say something that just sticks with you. Do any of you think back to, hopefully maybe once in this class, but you think back on your life and there was something a professor said, and sometimes even have the opportunity of going to the professor and telling them about it, and they look at you and go, I said that? I've had that opportunity now that I'm old enough to do that. But my Greek professor, I was taking a Life and Letters of Paul class from him. And I think about 88% of the class was completely unconscious at this point. But I was already involved with apologetics. So since I was already involved with apologetics, for example, when I took New Testament backgrounds in seminary, how many of you have taken a New Testament backgrounds class in seminary? I know you have. Most folks are just sort of like, they're just sort of sitting there, and every once in a while they'll take a note, just enough to get by. Because they can't see how this is relevant to them at all. Man, I knew how it was relevant to me. Old and New Testament backgrounds. I already realized that the enemies of faith, this is what they concentrated on. So I was just like, this is great. So Dr. Mike Baird was his name, was sort of droning on about some section in Paul. He says, now the word here in the Greek is the word for fear. And fear in the Greek means fear. And I'll never forget that. Fear in the Greek means fear. And it was not exactly the deepest insight. But you know, after you've heard all these people say, well, the original term actually means this, and then they wander off someplace, it was nice to hear somebody say, in the original Greek, it means fear. And when you've learned to read Greek, you've taught Greek for a few years, you'll have a lot of people, they're looking for gnosis, they're Gnostics, okay? And they'll come up to you in sort of a hushed voice, and they find out you read the language, they'll go, so there's always been this one verse, I've asked a lot of people, which means they've gone to all their pastors, and their pastors have said, no, that's not there, but they're still looking. And they come to you and say, what does this text say in Greek? And I'll get quiet and sort of lean into them and say, the very same thing it says in English. Talk about deflating somebody. I was like, really? Because they're thinking there's going to be some kind of, key to knowledge in here someplace, and in reality, the English translations do a pretty good job one way or the other. So the word fear here means fear. Gentleness and respect, gentleness and reverence, gentleness and fear resulting in having a good conscience. What does that mean? Well, it's one of the main reasons I can't use a lot of the arguments other people use against some of the religions I deal with. I've got to have a good conscience. I've got to be able to look at myself in the mirror. And when you use arguments that are simply meant to manipulate people rather than to speak the truth, I don't know how anybody does that. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror anymore. I want to have a good conscience. And so there has to be fear of God, reverence for his truth, and a gentleness, a respectfulness that should flow from the heart of a person who already recognizes that God dealt so gently with me. How can I act in another way? Apologists have a bad rap, but we have a bad rap because we generally fall into this. There are people who get into this. It's, I don't know who came up with the term, but it's one I've used for a long time. When people first become reformed, they enter what we call the cage stage. We were just talking about that. And this is where it would be better to put them in a cage so they don't hurt other people as well as themselves. Because they're running down the road, throwing copies of The Sovereignty of God by Arthur W. Pink at drunks. Repent! And then they're running into the Arminian church, and you need to read Calvin's Institutes, and stuff like this. And we call it the cage stage, where they're so excited, but that zeal is not quite tempered with maturity quite yet. And there are apologists that are very much the same way. And you put enough information into someone's hands, and you can traumatize a poor Mormon missionary. I mean, you really can. I met with a Mormon missionary, and he started calling me. I'd given him my number. He started calling me. I remember when it was. This was 1993. Yeah. And we'd have long conversations on the phone, which would end with my going, anything else? No, I don't have any answers to that. Okay, well, been good talking to you, Elder. Yeah, thanks. And so finally he says, I'd like you to come over to my apartment. And they're not supposed to do that. And if you've ever seen a Mormon missionary's apartment, there's a reason for that. There's nothing in a Mormon missionary's apartment. He and another missionary actually fooled their partners, lied to their partners to get their partners out someplace else, so that Rich Pierce and I could visit them at their apartment. And we sat down in this sparsely inhabited place on this couch that, oh my goodness, I was afraid of what was inside it, but I sat on it anyways and trusted the Lord's protection. And we had another conversation. They threw the best they could come up with at us. And we responded to everything, provided them with answers to everything. And it got quiet. And you know how there's that awkward silence, you know? And I said, well, and I'll never forget this. This missionary, now you know what the missionaries look like. They have their white shirts, dark ties, and they've got this elder whatever badge right here. This missionary reached down, grabbed his name badge, and flung it over his shoulder. They had to send him home. He didn't finish his mission. But they got him away from me as quick as they could. If you ever read my book, Letters to a Mormon Elder, now you know why it ends the way it ends. They send the missionary away to get him away from these folks. And there have been missionaries I've met with that I encountered years later in Salt Lake City. They weren't Mormons anymore. Sadly, they weren't anything because there had been no follow-up. They hadn't tried to contact anybody. Very often when people find out they were burned by one false religion, they figure everybody's faults. I mean, after the 1975 debacle for the Jehovah's Witnesses, remember they all thought 1975 was going to be it? Over 1 million people left the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society organization. And 99% of them never went anywhere. They're not in any churches. They are the religiously abused and used. There's a lot of former cult members, but very few former cult members who are saved. Most of them are just, I don't want anything to do with it, don't even talk to me, go away. So there needs to be a kind of gentleness that marks the giving of this response that can result in having a good conscience and having a good conscience. So there is the classical text on polemics, on giving a defense. And you will notice that really, I think if we're handling the text correctly, yeah, it's right there. We always need to be ready. It's not an option. It's not just for a certain class of people. It needs to be something we're always ready to do. And it also means that means we have to think about the society we're in and the situations we're in so that we can be ready. I mean, if you're an engineer, you're going to think about the types of objections that your fellow engineers are going to raise because those are the people you're around. You give thought to that. If you're church planting in Utah, you better know something about Mormonism. If you're church planting in Brooklyn, you better know something about Jehovah's Witnesses. If you're going anywhere near Dearborn, Michigan, you better know something about Islam, let alone going to Saudi Arabia or someplace like that. If you're going to be on a university campus, you better know about Bart Ehrman and the atheists. And there's wisdom that goes into thinking about these things and saying, here's where I'm going. This is where the Lord's leading. What are the kind of objections I'm going to be encountering? What are the kind of questions I'm going to be encountering? And there's nothing wrong in preparing for these things. You can prepare for these things in classes like this. You can prepare by listening to debates. You can prepare by reading books. There's all sorts of things you can do. But most Christians just sort of stumble into these situations without any preparation whatsoever. And it's just, and you know, the sad thing is that's where the gentleness and reverence disappears. Because when your back is against the wall, because you haven't prepared and you don't know any scriptures, you haven't done any scripture memorization, and you don't know what the other guy, you really don't know the answers, and you're afraid to admit you don't know the answers, and you're sort of embarrassed, that's when the emotions start coming up and the anger can start coming up. And it's a defense mechanism where you start raising your voice and making accusations. I've seen it on the other side over and over and over again. But unfortunately, I also see it amongst Christians, because they were not always ready to give a defense. And when the opportunity arose, or when they, in essence, were pushed into it, the result was something that would probably not encourage them to be involved in that again. And I think that's what lies behind a lot of people saying, no, we shouldn't do any of this stuff. All you do is preach the gospel. It's interesting. Who here knows what dawah is? One person knows what dawah is. Dawah is what Muslims do to us. And that does not mean bombing. That means, well, actually, that's the last step of it. Jihad is actually the last step after dawah has been given. Dawah is a calling to Islam. But it's interesting. In Islam, our two terms, evangelism and apologetics, are not distinguished from one another. They are under the category of dawah. And so the calling to Islam and the refuting of arguments against Islam are all part of one thing. For most evangelicals, evangelism is one thing. Apologetics is something else. How can that be in our society today? I can understand how that could have been in Kentucky in 1840. I can understand that. I mean, you put your hand on a Bible and swore to God you'd tell the truth in 1840 around here. And there was a general acceptance of the authority of the Bible as divine revelation and all sorts of stuff like that. Charles Darwin hadn't written yet. So, okay, but we ain't there no more. That's not the world we live in. The vast majority of the people you're talking to now, no matter where you live in Western society, have already been given a very stiff inoculation of anti-Christian secular humanism. And it's going to come out even in their honest questions. So the head stuck in the sand methodology just doesn't work anymore. We can't go there. And yet there are many people who would say, no, you just proclaim the gospel. Well, is that what Paul did? Well, he said, I want to know nothing but Jesus Christ, him crucified. That's true. But why did he write to the church of Colossae and warn them against false teachers that were coming in? And he uses the exact language that they themselves used to promote their heresies, to refute them. Pleroma, the fullness, the eons, all this terminology that the proto-Gnostics used, it eventually became the very essence of Gnostic theology in the 2nd century. Paul is anticipating that and using that in his writing to the Colossians. Paul engaged in dialogue and debate in the public square. Apollos did the same, and he helped greatly, according to Acts 17. By God's grace, he greatly encouraged those who had believed by his mastery of the Scriptures and his ability to engage the Jews in public disputation and demonstrate from the Scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. And so, if we live in a context where we know that there is in essence going to be objection, then we have to give thought ahead of time to what those objections are so that we are always ready to give a defense when that opportunity arises, because you don't know where it's going to be. You don't know when it's going to be. And sometimes it's not at the most convenient time, but that's when the opportunity is there. So this is the central text. There's no question about it. But I think it says a whole lot more than it's normally allowed to say. And hopefully spending so much time on it has not been a distraction for you, but in fact helps you to see even more clearly that this use of apologia and apologetics, where we get the very terminology, is part of a much broader, not just exhortation, but command to Christians to avoid the kind of, well, I don't think anyone's going to mind if I say this, Joel Osteen-ish that has infected so much of evangelicalism. A kind of Christianity that is a surface level, smiley, smiley, get the things I want, have straighter teeth and prettier hair type of Christianity that has no substance to it when it comes to how you respond to the actual trials and tribulations of life, which are going to be part of what Christ brings you through to conform you to his image. If anybody runs along and tells you that it's not God's will that you go through these difficulties, they don't know anything about the New Testament. And the resultant Christianity, well, a couple years ago I debated this one Muslim, and I would not debate him again. Not serious in any way, but we were driving down to another debate in San Diego. He was in the car with me, he and his wife, and we were talking, and he talked about the degradation, how degraded Christian nations were. And I said, name me a Christian nation. He says, well, the United States. And I said, wait a minute, do you think the majority of the people driving by us right now have given a single thought to the Lordship of Jesus Christ in the past 24 hours? Do you really think that? He had never been asked that before. I don't even know if he knew what the Lordship of Christ was, to be honest with you. I think I had to explain it. But I said, you're telling me that a nation that is so buried in its own lusts, in pornography and in abortion and in the kind of behavior that you see here, where you can't even talk about God in the public square anymore without people looking at you sideways. You think this is a Christian nation? Because I even had an imam in one of the debates we did say that Christianity invaded Iraq. Christianity invaded Iraq. I said, really? Is that what you think? And it is what they think. But for those folks, when they look at Christianity, what do they see? They don't see us. They don't see us. They see former basketball arenas turned into churches where people show up for an hour on Sunday morning, get entertained, and then they live their life like the rest of the world and call themselves Christians. That's Christianity. For many of them, the only gospel presentation they've ever heard is not a message of power. It's not a command. It's a very weak suggestion. And so it has an impact. It really, really, really does have an impact. And it's one of the biggest mountains I have to climb to try to disabuse people of the concepts that they have. Now, here's what we're going to do. When we start the next section, I want us to listen to a presentation by Christopher Hitchens. It's not the one I wanted, but most of Christopher's stuff is the same. I've listened to, I've lost track of how many hours of Christopher's presentations. How many of you have ever seen Christopher Hitchens? Okay. You all know that he's very ill. He's British, American citizen now, I believe. Incredibly intelligent, not overly well educated in Christian theology or history, that's for certain. How many of you saw the movie with Doug Wilson and Christopher Hitchens? Okay. Interesting. I will quote Douglas Wilson once. I'll quote it right now, get it out of the way, because it's a good quote. And he's exactly right. He said, there are two things you can say for absolute certainty about Christopher Hitchens. A, he does not believe God exists. B, he hates him. It's true. It's absolutely certain God doesn't exist. He hates the Christian God. He hates the Christian God. He hates Jesus. He really does. I mean, it borders on the irrational. He controls it until the end of some debates, but then he rips people to shreds. I listened to him do a debate just recently with a fairly well-known Southern Baptist. And like I said, since he's asking the full price now, he's just going to continue traveling the globe until he retires or dies, crushing the people that he's debating, because almost no one is taking him on in any meaningful fashion. And he won this debate hands down. It was horrible. But he finished it off, and I may try to find, during the break, if I can cue it up, I'll try to find the section to add to this other one that I've found. He detests certain elements of Christian theology, especially the atonement of Christ. Yet he has the ear of our society, partly because of that wonderful British accent, partly because he knows history well. He is an entertaining speaker. He's very intelligent. He's not nearly, he is as abrasive as Richard Dawkins, but far more interesting to listen to. I don't like Richard Dawkins, but I like Christopher Hitchens. I mean, on a personal level, you just want to shake the guy and say, would you listen to what you're saying? Because he says so many true things. And Dawkins is just an ideologue. He's just Richard Dawkins is the Peter Ruckman of Darwinian evolutionists. And only a few of you get that. Peter Ruckman is the worst of the King James only fundamentalists. I mean, he is just, wow. And Richard Dawkins is Peter Ruckman in reverse. It's fascinating. But Hitchens isn't like that. And so I want to listen. I will have a video, and then if I can find the audio clip, we can play it. But I want you to listen to a portion of a debate. We'll play it, like I said, at the beginning of the next session, where Hitchens is debating an Arminian evangelical. And what I found fascinating was, the general presentation will give you a good essence of the Hitchen-esque presentation. This was before he knew he was sick, of course. But then at one point, and I'm pretty certain it's in this clip, that's why I think I found it on my system, he identifies the fundamental problem with the apologetic methodology of the Arminian that we don't have to have, and that we don't have. And that will lead us to a discussion of that and why that's important.